Okay, the second collection of readings, the finishing of Paul Ray, section 4, ignorance of the causation of our actions. Hence, our volition with respect to some action is always causally determined, but it seems to be free of causes. It seems to be an absolute beginning. To what is this appearance due? We do not perceive the causes by which our volition is determined, and that is why we believe that it is not causally determined at all. How often do we do something while lost in thought? We pay no attention to what we are doing, let alone to the causes from which it springs. While we are thinking, we support our head with our hand. While we are conversing, we twist a piece of paper in our hand. If we then reflect on our behavior, stimulated perhaps by a conversation about the freedom of the will, and if we are quite incapable of finding a sufficient cause for it, then we believe that there is no sufficient cause for it at all. That consequently, we could have proceeded differently at that moment. Example, supporting our hand with our head with our left hand instead of our right. To adduce yet another example, suppose that there are 2 eggs on the table. I take one of them. Why not the other one? Perhaps the one I took was a little bit closer to me, a bit closer. Or some other trivial matter, which would be very difficult to discover and is of the kind that almost never enters our consciousness. It tipped the scales. If I now look back but do not see why I took that particular egg, then I come to think that I could just as well have taken the other. Let us replace I could have taken the other egg by other statements containing the expression I could have. For example, I could, when I took the egg, have chopped off my fingers instead. Or I could have jumped at my neighbor's throat. Why do we never adduce such statements? But always those contemplating an action close to the one that we carried out. Because at the moment when I took the egg, chopping off my fingers and murder were far from my mind. From this point of view, the 2 aspects of our subject matter, the fact that acts of will are necessary and that they appear not to be necessary, can be perceived especially clearly. In fact, taking the other egg was at that moment just as impossible as chopping off a finger. For whether a nuance of a sensation or a whole army of sensations and thoughts is lacking in the complete cause, obviously does not matter. The effect cannot occur so long as the cause is incomplete. But it seems as though it would have been possible to take the other egg at that moment. If something almost happened, we think that it could have happened. While in the case of unimportant matters, we perhaps do not notice the causes of our act of will and therefore think that it has no causes. The situation is quite different, it will be objected, in the case of important matters. We did not, after all, marry one girl rather than another while lost in thought. We did not close the sale of our house while lost in thought. Rather, everyone sees that motives determine such decisions. In spite of this, however, we think, I could have acted differently. What is the source of this error? In the case of unimportant matters, we do not notice the cause of our action at all. In the case of important ones, we perceive it, but not adequately. We do, to be sure, see the separate parts of the cause, but the special relation in which they stood to one another at the moment of the action eludes us. Let us first consider another example from the realm of animals. A vixen vacillated whether to sneak into the chicken coop to hunt for mice or to return to her young in her den. At last, she sneaked into the chicken coop. Why? Because she wanted to. But why did she want to? because this act of will on her part resulted from the relation in which her hunger, her fear of the watchdog, her maternal instinct, and her other thoughts, sensations, and impressions stood to one another at that time. But a vixen, within the gift of reflection, would, were she to look back upon her action, say, I could have willed differently. For although she realizes that hunger influenced her act of will, the degree of hunger on the one hand and the fear and maternal instincts on the other present at the moment of the action, elude her. Having become a different animal since the time of the action, perhaps because of it, she thinks, by way of a kind of optical illusion, that she was that other animal already then. It is the same in the case of man. Suppose, for example, that someone has slain his rival out of jealousy. What does he himself and what do others perceive with respect to this action? We see that on the one hand, jealousy, the desire for possessions, hatred, and rage were present in him, and on the other, fear of punishment, pity, and the thought of God. We do not, however, see the particular relation in which hatred and pity and rage and fear of punishment stood to one another at the moment of the deed. If we could see this, keep it fixed and recreate it recreate it experimentally, then everyone would regard this action as an effect, as a necessary result. Let us now, with the aid of our imagination, suppose that the sensations and thoughts of the murderer at the moment of the deed were spread out before us, clearly visible as if on a map. From this reflection, we shall learn that, in fact, we are lacking such an overview, and that this lack is the reason why we do not ascribe a cause or necessity to the action. The kaleidoscopic changing sensations, thoughts, and impressions would, in order of their relation to one another, become apparent. Have to be returned to that state in which they were at the moment of the deed, and then made rigid. And if they were being nailed in their place, as if they were being nailed in their place. But beyond that, the thoughts and sensations would have to be spatially extended and endowed with a colored surface. A stronger sensation would have to be represented by a bigger lump. A clearer thought would have to wear, say, a bright red color, a less clear one, a gray coloration. Jealousy and rage, as well as pity and the thought of God, would have to be plastically exhibited for us in this way. We would further have to see how the sight of the victim acts upon these structures of thoughts and sensations, and how there arises from these two factors, first, the desire to commit murder, and then the act of murder itself. Moreover, we would have to be able to repeat the process, perhaps as follows. We return the murderer to the state of mind that he had some years before the act of murder. We equip his mind with precisely the same thoughts and sensations, and his body with the same constitution. Then we let the very same impressions act upon him. That's not your phone. It's the fact that I haven't silenced mine, which is something we will start doing out of habit before we start these. There we go. Okay. Then we let the very same impressions act upon them. We bring him into contact with the same people. Let him read the same books. Nourish him with the same food. And finally, we will place the murdered person, after having called him back to life, before the murderer with the very same facial expressions, in the same illumination, and at the same distance. Then, as soon as the parts of the cause have been completely assembled, we would always see that the very same effect occurs, namely, wanting to commit and then committing murder. Finally, too, we would have to vary the experiment in the manner of the chemists. We would have to be able now to weaken the sensation, now to strengthen it, and to observe the result that this produces. If these conditions were fulfilled, if we could experimentally recreate the process and also vary it, if we were to see its components and above all their relation to one another with plastic clarity before us, on the one hand, the degree of jealousy and of rage present at the moment, and on the other, the degree of fear and punishment and of pity, then we would acknowledge that wanting to commit murder and committing murder are necessary results. But as it is, we merely see that on the one hand, jealousy and related feelings, and on the other, pity and the idea of God were present in the murderer. But since we do not see the particular relations in which these sensations and thoughts stood to one another at the moment of the deed, we simply think that the one side could have produced acts of will and actions as well as the other, that the murderer could, at that moment, when he wanted to commit and did commit murder, just as well have willed and acted differently, say, compassionately. It is the same if we ourselves are the person who acts. We too think, I could have willed differently. Let us illustrate this by yet another example. Yesterday afternoon at 6:03 o'clock, I sold my house. Why? Because I wished to do so. But why did I wish to do so? Because my intention to change my place of residence and other circumstances caused my act of will. But was I compelled to will? Could I not have postponed the sale or forgone it altogether? It seems so to me, because I do not see the particular relation in which my thoughts, sensations, and impressions stood to one another yesterday afternoon at 6:03 o'clock. Thus, we do not see the sufficient cause, either not at all in the case of unimportant matters, or inadequately in the case of important ones. Consequently, it does not exist for us. Consequently, we think that our volition and our values were not causally determined at all, that we could just as well have willed and acted differently. No one would say, I could have willed differently, if he could see his act of will and its causes displayed plastically before him in an experiment permitting repetition. But who are the mistaken we of whom we are speaking here? Patently, the author does not consider himself to be one of them. Does he, then, set himself, along with a few fellow philosophers, apart from the rest of mankind, regarding them as ignorant of the truth? Well, it really is not the case that mankind has always concerned itself with the problem of freedom and of will, and only a small part arrive at the result that the will is not free. Rather, in pre-civilized ages, no one, and in civilized ages, almost no one, concerned himself with this problem. But of the few who did address themselves to this question, as the history of philosophy teaches us, almost all recognized that there is no freedom of will. The others became victims of the illusion described above, without ever coming to grips with the problem in its general form. Is the will subject to the law of causality or not? Section 5. Determinism is inconsistent with judgments of moral responsibility. We hold ourselves and others responsible without taking into account the problem of the freedom of the will. Experience shows that if someone has lied or murdered, he is told that he has acted reprehensibly and deserves punishment. Whether his action is uncaused or whether, like the other processes of nature, it is subject to the law of causality, how would people come to raise such questions in the ordinary course of their lives? Or has anyone ever heard of a case in which people talking about an act of murder, a lie, or an act of self-sacrifice discussed these actions in terms of the freedom of the will? It is the same as if we ourselves are the person who acted. We say to ourselves, oh, if only I had not done this. Oh, if only I had acted differently. Or, I have acted laudably, as one should act. At best, a philosopher here or there chances upon the question whether our actions are causally determined or not, certainly not the rest of mankind. Suppose, however, that someone's attention is directed to the fact that the will is not free. At first, it will be very difficult to make this plausible to him. His volition is suspended from threads that are too nearly invisible. His volition is suspended from threads that are too nearly invisible. And that is why he comes to think that it is not causally determined at all. At last, however, we shall assume he does come to realize that actions are effects, that their causes are thoughts and impressions, that these must likewise be viewed as effects, and so on. How will he then judge these actions? Will he continue to maintain that murder is to be punished by reprisal, and that benevolent actions are to be considered meritorious? By no means. Rather, the first conclusion that he will validly draw from his newly acquired insight is that we cannot hold anyone responsible. No one can be made to answer for an effect. I'm not going to pronounce the French that he wrote here accurately, but tu comprendre c'est tu pardonner, which means no one can be made to answer for an effect, it seems. We have to learn French. In order to illustrate this important truth that whoever considers intentions to be effects will cease to assign merit or blame for them, let us resume discussion of the examples above. From early childhood on, the bogo, this is his example. Well, we're not doing the lecture. Okay. From early childhood on, the bogo has learned to praise murder. The praiseworthiness of such an action already penetrated the consciousness of the child as a secondary meaning of the word murder, and afterward, it was confirmed by every impression. His gods and his fellow men praise murder. In consequence, he involuntarily judges acts of murder to be praiseworthy. No matter whether it was himself or someone else who committed them. Let us assume now that a philosopher had succeeded in persuading the bogos that the act of murder was the intention to practice cruelty, and the intention to practice cruelty are causally determined. Then their judgment would undergo an essential modification. To conceive of actions and intentions as causally determined, after all, means the following. We go back in the history of the individual, say to his birth, and investigate which of his characteristics are inborn and to which causes they are due. Then, ever guided by the law of causality, we trace the development of transformation of these properties. We see how impressions, teachings, and examples come to him, and if his inborn constitution has an affinity for them, are taken up and transformed by it. Otherwise, passing by without leaving a trace. Finally, we recognize that the keystone, the necessary result of this course of development, is the desire to commit murder and the act of murder. A bogo who looks upon murder and the intention to practice cruelty in this way, that is, as an effect, will say that it is impossible to regard them as meritorious. But will he now look upon these actions with apathy, devoid of all feeling? By no means. He will still consider them to be pleasant or unpleasant, agreeable or disagreeable. When the action is directed against himself, he will perceive it as pleasant or as unpleasant. The prospect of being murdered is unpleasant for everyone, whether he considers the action to be causally determined or uncaused. Similarly, our liking or disliking for the character of a human being will persist even if we regard it as the result of causes. To say that I find someone agreeable means that I am drawn to him, I like him. Of a landscape, too, one says that it is agreeable, and just as this liking cannot be diminished, even if we consider the trees, meadows, and hills to be the results of causes. the result of causes. So our liking for the character of a human being is not diminished if we regard it subspecie necessitatis. Hence, to the Bogo, who has come to see that murder is causally determined, it is still agreeable or disagreeable. Usually, he will consider it to be agreeable. He will say that it warms the cockles of his heart to observe such an action. It accords with his wild temperament, as yet untouched by civilization. Therefore, he will, in view of the necessity, suspend only the specifically moral practice of regarding it as meritorious. But his liking may become love, and even esteem and reverence. It will be objected, however, that I revere a mode of behavior entails I consider it meritorious for a person to behave in that way, and similarly for esteem. To be sure, the words reverence and esteem frequently have this meaning, and to the extent that they do, a determinist would cease using them. But all words that denote human feelings have not only one, but several meanings. They have, if I may express it in that way, a harem of meanings. And they couple now with this one and now with that one. So if I revere someone, it means also that I esteem him, that he impresses me, and that I wish to be like him. Reverence and esteem in this sense can coexist with determinism. Hence, the Bogo, who conceives of the intention to practice cruelty and the act of murder as effects, can nevertheless consider this to be agreeable or disagreeable. And in a certain sense, he can also have esteem and reverence for them, but he will not regard them as meritorious. Let us consider the act of murder at high levels of civilization. Civilization, as it progressed, stigmatized murder and threatened penalties for it on earth and in heaven. This censure already penetrates the consciousness of the child as a secondary meaning of the word murder, and afterward is confirmed through every impression. All the people whom one knows, all the books that one reads, the state with its institutions, pulpit and stage, always use murder in a censorious sense. That is how it comes to be, that we involuntarily declare an act of murder to be blameworthy, be it that others or what we ourselves, driven by passion, committed it. Whether the action was determined by causes or uncaused, that question is raised neither by the person who acted nor by the uninvolved observers. Forgive me, the computer went to sleep. Hopefully the recording's still working. Okay. All right, so we're not regarding it that way, the unobserved, the observers, okay. Or the uninvolved observers. But if it is raised, if someone considers the act of murder subspecie necessitatis, then he ceases to regard it as blameworthy. He will then no longer want to see punishment in the proper sense, suffering as retribution, meted out for it, but merely punishment as a safety measure. The feelings of liking and dislike, however, will continue to exist even then. On the whole, someone raised at a high level of civilization will have a feeling of dislike for acts of murder. He will not feel drawn to whoever commits it. He will not like him, for such an act does not accord with his temperament, which was formed as he was engaged in nonviolent occupations. In spite of the recognition that the action was necessary, this dislike can at times grow to revulsion, and even to contempt, given that the latter notion is stripped of the specifically moral elements that it contains, the attribution of blame. It will then mean something like this: I do not want to be like that person. The situation is the same in the case of benevolent actions and those performed out of a sense of duty. We cease to regard them as meritorious if we consider them to be effects. Let us look more closely at actions performed out of a sense of duty. To say that someone acts out of a sense of duty means that he performs an action perhaps contrary to his inclinations, because his conscience commends him to do it. But how does conscience come to issue such commandments? As follows. With some actions and intentions, there is linked for us from early childhood on a categorical thou shalt do or have them. For example, you should help everyone as much as possible, unquote. If someone then makes this habitual judgment into the guiding principle of his behavior, if he helps a person because his conscience commands, thou shalt help thy fellow man, then he is acting out of a sense of duty. If we want to consider such an action from the point of view of eternity and necessity, we shall have to proceed as follows. We investigate, 1, the constitution of the child who receives this teaching, thou shalt help. 2, the constitution of those who gave it to him. The child absorbing this doctrine has some inborn constitution of nerves, of blood, of imagination, and of reason. The commandment, thou shalt help, is impressed upon this substance with some degree of insistence. The deity, heaven, hell, approval of his fellow man, and of his own conscience. These ideas are presented to him, depending upon his teachers, as being more or less majestic and inspiring. As the child transforms them with greater and lesser intensity, depending upon his receptivity. The ultimate constitution of a man, the preponderance within him of the sense of duty over his own desires, is in any case a necessary result, a product of his inborn constitution and the impressions received. To someone who contemplates this, such a temperament may, to be sure, still seem agreeable, perhaps because he himself is or would like to be similarly constituted. But no one can regard as meritorious behavior that he conceives to be an effect. But what if we ourselves are the person who acted? Then the circumstances are analogous. Then too, liking and dislike remain, while the attribution of merit or blame, the pangs of conscience, disappears. Our own action, too, can remain agreeable or become disagreeable for us after it has occurred. It is agreeable if the disposition from which we acted persists after the action. It will become disagreeable if we change our frame of mind. Suppose, for example, that we have acted vengefully and are still in the same mood. Then the act of revenge is still agreeable, whether we conceive it to be an effect or not. If, however, a feeling of pity takes the place of our desire for revenge, then we come to dislike our action. We cannot stand our earlier self. The less so, the more pronounced our feeling of pity is. The reflection that the action is an effect in no way affects this feeling of dislike, perhaps of disgust, or even of revulsion for ourselves. We say to ourselves that the desire for revenge was, to be sure, necessarily stronger than the ideas and impressions that stood in its way. Hence, the action took place necessarily too. But now it happens that pity is necessarily present, and along with it, regrets that we acted as we did. Final section, section 6. I'm so tempted to talk about it, but we're going to just do the readings here. Can we abandon judgments of moral responsibility? So is it even possible to get rid of that other insight? Okay, we're not talking about it. Here we go. But is it really possible to shake off feelings of guilt so easily? Do they disappear like a spook when the magic word affect is pronounced? Is the situation with respect to this feeling not quite like that with regard to dislike? It was, to be sure, necessary that I took revenge, but now I necessarily feel dislike for my own action along with guilt. I can no more prevent the onset of the one feeling than the other. But if the feeling of guilt asserts itself in spite of the recognition that actions are effects, should we not suspect that our holding others responsible too will persist in spite of this insight? Did we commit an error somewhere? Is it that responsibility and necessity do not exclude one another? The situation is as follows. The reason why we assign moral praise to some actions and moral censure to others has already been mentioned repeatedly. Censure already penetrates the consciousness of the child as a secondary meaning of the words murder, theft, vengefulness, and pleasure in another's pain. The praise as a secondary meaning of the words benevolence and mercy. That is why censure seems to him to be a constituent part of murder and praise of benevolence. At a later point in his life, perhaps in his 20th year, the insight comes to him that from somewhere, that all actions are effects and therefore cannot earn merit or blame. What can this poor little insight accomplish against the accumulated habits of a lifetime of judging? The habit of mind of assigning blame for actions like murder makes it very difficult to think of them without this judgment. It is all very well for reason to tell us that we may not assign blame for such actions since they are effects. Our habit of judging, which has become a feeling, will see to it that it is done anyway. But let habit confront habit. Suppose that whenever someone involuntarily wants to assign blame or merit for an action, he ascends to the point of view of eternity and necessity. He then regards the action as the necessary result of a chain of events stretching back into the infinite past. Through that way of looking at things, the instinctive association between the action and the judgment will be severed. If not the first time, then perhaps by the 1,000th. Such a man will shed the habit of assigning blame or merit for any action whatsoever. In fact, of course, human beings almost never behave like that. This way of looking at things is completely foreign to them. Furthermore, human beings determine their actions by considering whether they will make them happy or unhappy, by shedding the habit of making judgments. But shedding the habit of making judgments of moral responsibility would hardly increase their happiness. The situation with respect to a person's character is no different from that with respect to his individual actions. Customarily, one assigns blame or merit, whether to himself or to others, for a single action, a single act of cheating or of giving offense. But sometimes we go back from the action to its source, to a person's character. In reality, of course, character, in its broadest as well as its smallest traits, is just as necessary as an individual action. It is the product of a chain of events stretching back into the infinite past. Be it that it was inherited in its entirety, or that it was formed in part during the individual's lifetime. But with regard to character, too, hardly anyone adopts this point of view. Just as in the case of particular actions, character is regarded neither as free nor as necessary. That is to say, people do not raise the question at all whether the law of causality is applicable also to actions and character. Hence, one assigns blame and merit for character as for actions, though they are effects. For one does not see that they are effects. If one sees this, if one regards character subspecie necessitatis, then he ceases to assign blame or merit for it. Liking and dislike, on the other hand, nevertheless persist even then. A character closely related to mine will garner my liking, my love, and perhaps even, in the sense mentioned above, my esteem and reverence, whether I conceive of it as an effect or not. Hence, we assign blame or merit for character and actions out of the habit of judging, without concerning ourselves with the question whether they are causally determined or not. We cease to assign blame or merit for character and actions as soon as we recognize that they are causally determined, if we ignore the remnants of our habits. Let us recapitulate. The character, the intentions, and the actions of every human being are effects. And it is impossible to assign blame or merit for effects.